I'm Mary O'Brien. I'm with the Friends of the Walpole Public Library. And I know I'm not the person you came to see this evening. We'll get to him in just a second after my brief commercial. Just thank you for coming out tonight. This program is sponsored by the Friends of the Library. We encourage you to join our group. It's the dues aren't very expensive, but they help fund programs like this one. So we'd love to have you join us. And also, if you have suggestions for people you'd like to have, you can, Philip's here, I'm here, so other people from the Friends, just let us know if it's reasonable. We'll try and get them, or even a topic that you're interested in. So just a couple of programs we have coming up. October 29th, we have another history program. Judith Calora, who you might not recognize that name, but she's history at play. She reenacts other women of history, and she's going to do her program about Rachel Revere, which I haven't seen, but I hear that it's wonderful. So looking forward to that, October 29th. Barry Pell, who's another person you might remember, the travel person. He's going to talk about Greenland, which has been in the news a little bit. And that's November 12th. Jane Blair of Art Matters is going to talk about Impressionism later on in November. And we'll have December, our annual meeting is December 8th. And we'll have, in addition to our business meeting, Ken Gloss of the Brattle Bookshop. Some people might be familiar with that. So used books. So he's also going to do some appraising books. So if you have a book at home and you wonder if you should put it in the recycling, bring it here, or bring it and make, thousands of dollars on your aunt's old book that's you've been collecting dust. That would be the time to bring it. So that's December 8th. And also the Senior Moments Chorus is going to be performing. Okay, now our main attraction is Stephen Puleo is going to, who's the author of 8 books. He's also retired teacher of history at Suffolk. He also teaches writing. He's written 8 books. And this evening he's going to talk to us about his latest, which is The Great Abolitionist, Charles Sumner, The Fight for a More Perfect Union.
Thank you, Mary. How's the sound in here? Is that okay? Yeah. I'll hold it down a little lower. Does that sound okay? Good. Everybody here okay? Excellent. If for some reason my voice starts to flag, just raise your hand. I tend to project pretty well. This is my 731st appearance as an author, so when you speak a lot, your voice, yeah. Well, I have to tell you, on my way here today, I was thinking, this is my 5th time here in Walpole at the library. This library, as a matter of fact, thank you. Yeah, you can. I was here for Dark Tide. I was here for the caning of Charles Sumner, which is kind of a subset of this book. I was here for American Treasures, Voyage of Mercy, and now here. And I think 2012 was the caning. I think the library was, either the library was new or this room was new, right?
Brand new.
Brand new, thank you. Yes, thank you. I remember that. And I've also been to Walpole High, I think 4 times. There's a couple of great history teachers there that teach Dark Tide in the Molasses Flood as part of their AP history course, juniors. So I spent a lot of time in Walpole. Of those 731 appearances, that's like 9. It's a lot. It's a lot in Walpole. So the way I like to do it, many of you have seen me before. I appreciate you coming up to me. I like to do, I have some things I want to say today about Charles Sumner and that era, remarkable era. At the end of it, I like to do Q&A. And the Q&A is always my favorite part. So when we get to it, please feel free to ask anything about this book, about writing. I get a lot of writing process questions. Always happy to answer history, things like that. And if I can answer it, I will definitely answer it. So does that sound like a pretty good agenda? Yeah. Excellent. We'll do it that way. And as I said, any issues with hearing, let me know. Like if I get too close like that, see, you have to source it, right? Yes. So I'll keep it down here as best that I can. So first of all, some people have come up to me and said they've read the book. Have there been people that have read The Great Abolitionist? Okay, thank you. How many people have heard of Charles Sumner? Okay, that's a pretty good group. So, interesting. I had a presentation the other night where somebody came up to me and said, listen, I am very excited to be here because the only thing I know about Charles Sumner, the only thing I know is that the Sumner Tunnel was named after him. So I said to the person, well, it was not named after him. It was named after a general from East Boston who's largely forgotten to history during the War of 1812. Sumner Tunnel's not named for Charles Sumner, so if that's the only thing you know about him, then you know literally nothing about him. And so you should read this book. So have a little fun with that. Sumner is one of these characters in American history, I think one of the most important and influential characters in all of American history. I call him kind of the Forrest Gump of the 19th century. He's in the middle of everything that's important during the most tempestuous, tumultuous, polarizing, divisive times in American history, the 1850s and the 1860s, those 2 decades. That is, the run-up to the Civil War, the war itself, the assassination of a president, and a good chunk of Reconstruction. Sumner's in the middle of all of that. Now, there hasn't been a biography of him in over 50 years. The last biography of Sumner was David Donald. He did a 2-volume biography, a Harvard historian who did one volume in 1960, 1 volume in 1970. And that's been it. That was it until The Great Abolitionist came out. So what I feel about Sumner here is he's in the middle of all this stuff. He's one of the great anti-slavery voices in American history and one of the great equal rights voices in American history. So when you ask who's Charles Sumner, the literal answer to that question is he's the United States Senator from Massachusetts from his first election in 1851 at the age of 40 until he dies in 1874. So that's the 23-ish years, almost a quarter of a century that he's in the Senate. And as I said, during this period of time. He is, during this period of time, the conscience of the North, when it was not easy to be the conscience of the North and not fashionable to be the conscience of the North. He argues for the limitation of slavery. He argues ferociously for the limitation of slavery when it wasn't fashionable. For an end to slavery when it wasn't fashionable, and it was really very difficult to do. He starts very, very early. So I put Sumner in this group of just a small handful of influential non-presidents. So if you go through our history, think Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, Susan B. Anthony, Martin Luther King, and Charles Sumner is right there. Like that's if you're a basketball fan, that rounds out the starting 5, I think, of non-presidents who are extremely influential. And so when I say that Sumner is the person who's been in office for 23 years during the 1850s and 1860s, it almost sounds a little bit mild or a little bit benign when I say it that way. But if I say it this way, I want you to just think about your high school history days or your college history days. Sumner is the U.S. Senator from Massachusetts and the anti-slavery crusader from Massachusetts during the Fugitive Slave Law, right? During the Kansas-Nebraska Act, during Bleeding Kansas, during Bleeding Sumner, when he's beaten to within an inch of his life by Preston Brooks with a cane. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, the Dred Scott decision, John Brown's raid, Lincoln's election, the South's secession, right? The beginning of war, Fort Sumner, the Emancipation Proclamation, Gettysburg, the Battle of Antietam, the Battle of Virginia in 1864, the end of the war in 1865, Lincoln's assassination, and then he's part of that Reconstruction period, that really, I would say, controversial and difficult Reconstruction period when we're trying to decide how the southern states get readmitted back into the Union. And Sumner's really instrumental in the 3 great Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution, right? The 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery, the 14th Amendment that says blacks are citizens and brings equal protection and due process clauses into the Constitution, and the 15th Amendment that gives black men the right to vote, right, in 1870. So, pretty remarkable time. And oh, by the way, the cherry on top of all that, and and there's much going on underneath, but the cherry on top of all that is Charles Sumner is very influential in helping to seat Hiram Revels into the United States Senate in 1870. Who is Hiram Revels? He is the United States Senator from Louisiana, when Louisiana gets brought back into the Union. He is the first African-American member, from Mississippi, and he's the first African-American member of Congress. And Hiram Revels takes the seat of the former President of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis. So he's the first African-American member of Congress who takes Jeff Davis's seat in Congress. Just very ironic, very huge. And I say Sumner's influential in helping to seat him, because remember, during this period of time, senators are not directly elected. The senators to the United States Senate are elected by the state legislatures. They're not elected by the popular vote of the people until 1913, when an amendment to the Constitution comes out to declare that. So Davis, Revels is elected by the Mississippi legislature, but there's still a question as to whether he can be seated. Because he is black, because Mississippi's not totally back into the Union yet, there was some controversy. Sumner is the person that makes that happen. So he's very, very much involved in that. So Sumner does this, through great personal cost, right? It costs him socially, this kind of anti-slavery crusade, this equal rights crusade. It costs him economically, it costs him politically, and it costs him physically. As I said, he's beaten to within an inch of his life in 1856 on the Senate floor. So he goes through that as part of his whole growth process and part of becoming what I would call the conscience of the North. Sumner is the loudest, clearest, most unwavering, most steadfast anti-slavery equal rights voice in the North during this period. It is not William Lloyd Garrison. It is not Maria Weston Chapman. It is not even Frederick Douglass. Sumner holds that role because of his position and because of his passion. And he is also remarkably of high character, and I'll say this, he was unbuyable, he was unbribable, and I never saw him once compromise on something he had deep beliefs in for the sake of political expediency. So something to keep in mind as we talk about him and learn about him tonight. The other thing is, Charles Sumner does all of this, right, while not being the most likable guy in the world. From a personal standpoint, he does not get along with people all that well. Like, I like to say, he fights for the people, but he doesn't really like people that much. It's kind of an odd thing. The old, you wouldn't want to have a beer with Charles Sumner. He had very difficult relationships with his family. He's one of 9 children. He's a twin, has almost no relationship with his twin sister, which is very unusual. Difficult relationship with his father, tough relationship with his friends. His friends could only take him in small doses. We all have friends like that, right? You may be one of those people, but people could take it in small doses. He was almost humorless, did not have a very good sense of humor. The large part of this book is Sumner's relationship with Lincoln. And of course, Lincoln has a great sense of humor, so we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But Sumner does not really have that. One of his Harvard classmates said that you could tell Charles Sumner that the moon was made of green cheese, and he would spend the next 3 hours arguing with you scientifically why that couldn't be so. He did not have a great sense of humor. And I bring this up because I think it's important to know the man and know the character, but also he's in a business that friendships and alliances are very important, politics. And it kind of hurts him in a few different steps along his career, including when he's beaten, that he doesn't really have these close friendships. He does have one his whole life, and that's Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. They're very good friends. He's also very good friends with Fanny Longfellow, Henry's wife. He's devastated when Fanny dies, that horrible death. She burns to death from sealing wax in her home in Cambridge. But again, Sumner is not really great at reading the room. He was very good friends with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and when Henry announces that he's going to marry Fanny Appleton, soon to be Fanny Appleton Longfellow, Sumner wonders, what am I going to do without you, Henry? We have these great, discussions, we have cocktails, we have coffee, and we talk politics. What am I going to do? So Fanny Longfellow suggests that Sumner come along on a honeymoon. Sumner, not really very good at reading the room, says, "Sounds good to me," and goes on the honeymoon. So not a lot of commenting or documentation on exactly how that honeymoon went, but it kind of gives you a sense of Charles Sumner. The thing about Sumner is he starts this anti-slavery crusade, he starts this equal rights crusade, probably more accurately, even before he's elected. In 1849, 2 years before he's elected, Charles Sumner argues before the Massachusetts Supreme Court on behalf of 5-year-old Sarah Roberts, a black girl who is forbidden here in Boston to attend a white school. She has to walk by 4 all-white schools to get to an all-black school. Her father sues the Boston School Committee and loses, and the lower court, and so it goes to the Supreme Court, which was kind of the way things worked at the time. And Sumner really delivers this very powerful appeal and really establishes precedent. He's like 100 years plus before his time. For the first time in American courtroom, equal justice under the law is uttered, and it's uttered by Charles Sumner in the Massachusetts Supreme Court. For the first time in America, the words separate but equal are inherently unequal are uttered in a courtroom, and it's uttered by Charles Sumner. So Sumner sets the stage not just for the 14th Amendment language in 1868, not just for that, but he's literally 105 years ahead of his time. Because if you look, in 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case, school desegregation case, Thurgood Marshall arguing on behalf of the plaintiffs uses almost the exact same language Sumner used in Boston in 1849. Very, very amazing, that type of language. So Sumner kind of sets this. He's literally a century ahead of his time, talking about equal rights and talking about equal protection under the law, and separate but equal is inherently unequal, were quite foreign notions, even in so-called progressive Boston at the time, but very foreign notions in 1849. Just keep in mind the timetable that we're talking about. Sumner was elected in 1851 on the heels and because of, almost directly, the Fugitive Slave Law that is part of the Compromise of 1850. Fugitive Slave Law. Would you like to give us just a quick summary of the Compromise of 1850? I'm joking. She's looking at me horrified. I'm joking. Compromise of 1850. By the way, there's going to be a few things that I talk about tonight where you used to say in high school to your history teacher, why do I need to know this? This is one of those. So the Compromise of 1850 comes about for a very unusual reason. It comes about after gold is discovered in California. So think about this. For the last 30 years, ever since the Missouri Compromise of 1820, Congress had kind of managed the slavery issue. You know, compromises here, compromises there. The senators like Daniel Webster and Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun wielded a lot of power and compromised to kind of maintain that, I would say, fragile truce that was in place since the Missouri Compromise. And by the way, quick refresher, Missouri Compromise of 1820, everything below, beneath the very famous 3630 parallel, slavery would be allowed, right? Well, below the Mason-Dixon, but that 3630 parallel. Everything above the 3630 parallel, slavery would be prohibited, except in one state, Missouri. Very unusual compromise. And Congress decides, in order to even things off, we're going to take a large chunk of the state of Massachusetts and create a new free state and call it Maine, right? So when you go to Maine and you see your Gunkwit t-shirt that says Maine established 1820, that's part of the Missouri Compromise, that's what happens. So for that 30-year period, up till the Compromise of 1850, it had been this sort of managing of the truce, of the slavery issue. Not a lot of debate, almost no debate in Congress, zero. And so it had been managed. Now gold gets discovered in California. What happens? Hundreds of thousands of people go west to seek their fortunes. And so many people go west so fast that California almost literally skips the territory stage and applies for statehood to the Union quite quickly. Only one problem. At the time, there are 15 slave states and 15 free states. California applies for admission as a free state. South, not very happy about this. Not only is this going to quite literally change the balance of power in the Senate, 2 new senators will be coming in from a free state. But the South believes, and I think correctly, that if California is admitted unimpeded as a free state, that could stop momentum for slavery in other territories across the West. So the South demands something in return. What they demand in return is this very stringent, very difficult fugitive slave law. And the fugitive slave law that Congress passes after it's fashioned by Daniel Webster of Massachusetts and Henry Clay of Kentucky, they're the 2 architects of the fugitive slave law, right? It says this, it says that if a runaway slave makes his way, and I'm using his because it's almost always a male, between the ages of 18 and 25, not only the most healthy, physically able of the slaves, but also the most valuable of the slaves as far as the slaveholders are concerned. If that person makes his way north on his way to Canada or just to a free state, when he's in the free state and slave hunters come hunting, which they almost always did for that particular classification of slave, then the police, the sheriffs, the court, the entire legal structure of that free state was required to assist in the recapture, to send the slave back to bondage. That's the fugitive slave law, the main piece of the Compromise of 1850. So in Boston in 1851, April of 1851, Boston sends its very first slave back to slavery. His name is Thomas Sims. He had run away from Savannah, owner in Savannah, stowed away on a ship that made its way up the coast, hid away in South Boston for a while, but then is caught in downtown Boston when one of the slave hunters comes hunting for him. It's an enormous controversy in Boston. So he gets imprisoned, and after a very cursory court case, which is part of the fugitive slave law, he is ordered sent back to Savannah. And on an April morning, 4:30 in the morning, he's taken out of his cell in the courthouse in downtown Boston, and he's put in what is called a hollow square of police and troops, put in the middle of that square, and the square of troops, and he marched down to the docks. Abolitionists are surrounding them, just kind of saying, shame, shame, and is put on a boat and sent back to Georgia. So the abolitionist community is kind of outraged by this. Wow, can you believe this? Boston, the cradle of liberty, sends a slave back, fugitive slave back. It kind of mobilizes the abolitionist community and mobilizes a lot of the abolitionists in the North in general. Up to this point, the abolitionist community, Sumner even had problems with them because they were great at making speeches and they were great at writing editorials, but they weren't great at a lot of action. But after this, after the slave Sims is sent back, the abolitionist movement becomes a little bit more, I would say, militant. So they provide slaves with alibis and hiding places and money and clothing and transportation and those kinds of things. A lot of the Underground Railroad takes place almost after, not entirely, but almost a lot of it after the fugitive slave law. So important thing to keep in mind. Now, at the exact same time all this is happening, Massachusetts needs a new U.S. senator. Why? Daniel Webster has moved into Millard Fillmore's cabinet as Secretary of State. So somebody's got to fill the Daniel Webster seat. is a huge battle in the Mass legislature. The Senate is kind of fighting a long time. The House finally takes it up in January of '51. And for 4 months, the House can't agree on who the senator is going to be. Like, all the major candidates kind of fall to the wayside. They don't get enough votes. All of a sudden, right on the heels of the Thomas Sims case, just after Sims is sent back to Georgia, and by the way, is given 39 lashes on his bare back, which is the penalty for running away. Right on the heels of that, another vote comes up, and this dark horse candidate emerges from nowhere. It's Charles Sumner. So we're talking anti-slavery stuff for a while now. And Sumner prevails, wins the Senate seat by 1 vote in the legislature. By 1 vote. Goes to Washington towards the end of 1851 when they're back in session. And in 1852, very important year, 1852, he delivers the first, think about this, the first major anti-slavery speech in American history, 1852. He does it as he moves to strike the fugitive slave law, to abolish, to overturn the fugitive slave law. And he delivers this speech, 4-hour speech, and it's called Freedom National, Slavery Sectional. Shortened up to be Freedom National. That's what Sumner gave as a speech. And in this speech, Charles Sumner turns the slavery debate on its head. Up till now, think about this, up till now, the South had declared that slavery was legal, not just in the states, but also in the federal territories like DC, the other territories along the waterways, etc. That slavery was legal because there was nothing specifically in the Constitution that prohibited it. That's the South's argument. That had been the argument that had kind of prevailed, really since the Constitution was ratified and adopted and ratified. Sumner comes in and turns that argument on its head. And Sumner says, no. If you read the founders, he revered the founders. He was very akin to Lincoln in that area. Revered the founders, revered the founding documents, the Declaration of the Constitution. He said, we're a country founded, we haven't achieved it yet, but we're founded, dedicated to the proposition, as Lincoln would say later, that all men are created equal. That's in the Declaration of Independence. And you can tell when you look at the debates of the Constitutional Convention that many of the founders were opposed to slavery, and many of them recognized the contradiction, the dichotomy between having slavery and the all men are created equal paragraph, clause of the Declaration. But that in order for them to get the country off the ground, in order for slavery to have a chance to be abolished, they needed to ratify this Constitution with its principles of freedom and liberty. And it couldn't be ratified if there had been an all-out attempt to prohibit slavery in the Constitution. Why? The Georgians would not have ratified, the South Carolinians would not have ratified, probably the North Carolinians wouldn't have ratified, and most important, the very powerful, very influential Virginians would not have ratified. And so the founders kind of make this compromise where they talk about freedom, they talk about liberty, and they put in the Constitution that there'll be no effort to end the transatlantic slave trade until 1808. Many of the founders believed that slavery would die its own death in a decade or so. Technology reasons, economic reasons, all of that. Eli Whitney changes that, the poor guy with the cotton gin. I mean, he develops this scientific, technological thing having nothing to do with politics for the most part. But what does it do? It increases the output of a typical slave by a factor of 50. And really, the cotton gin is what gives us big cotton. But Sumner says if you look at other things, like the Northwestern Ordinance approved in 1787, which prohibited slavery in the new territories that include present-day Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and you look at all of the founders' writings, it's very clear that they were antsy about slavery. They recognized it, and that's why they didn't affirmatively mention it in the Constitution. And Sumner says if it's not affirmatively mentioned in the Constitution, then it's not legal. You can't, he said, surmise slavery. You cannot infer slavery. You cannot engage in conjecture of slavery. He said, if you look at the founding documents, the notion of slavery is absurd because their principles of liberty and freedom obliterate the very idea of slavery. That's the speech that he's making on the floor of the Senate in 1852. It's kind of a revolutionary speech at the time. He also says, so he turns the South's argument on its head. He also turns the abolitionist argument on its head. Why? The abolitionist argument, many of the more radical abolitionists had suggested that the only way for the United States to get rid of slavery was to rip up the Declaration of Independence, rip up the Constitution, and start again. What did that do? That made the abolitionist movement in many states, among many moderates in the North, almost an anti-American movement. There were many moderates in the North that wanted nothing to do with abolitionists because of that. Sumner says, no. We don't need to tear up the Declaration and the Constitution. The principles are already there. The fact that there's slavery is a perversion of the underlying messages of those two documents, not an inevitable outgrowth of them. Very important point. So he turns that on its head, and the abolitionist movement suddenly becomes a little bit more mainstream. Sumner is the person that puts the stake in the ground right there. And then Sumner says this: if you love America, you must hate slavery. That's the principle of the founding of the country. So he makes a very big impression on this first speech, and then moves to abolish the fugitive slave law. And he loses the vote 47-4. I'm telling you, wonderful speech, not a great outcome. Sumner loses at 47-4. He's a little bit devastated. I think he didn't really expect it to pass, but didn't expect to get beaten as badly as it did. But at that point, the Northerners wanted this compromise in place. The Southerners, no way they were going to eliminate the fugitive slave law. So he loses at 47-4. But what does happen, Sumner automatically becomes the conscience of the North. Automatically becomes this strong anti-slavery voice. The South looks at him and says, whoa, we got to watch this guy. He may not be able to be compromised with. He could be dangerous. He could be dangerous in this whole slavery discussion and slavery issue. Sumner keeps at that up until 1854, with a very, very controversial and famous, something you all know about and can all tell me about, so I'll be quiet and listen. 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed. Remember Kansas-Nebraska? Who wants to start? I'll start. No worries. Kansas-Nebraska Act, kind of this unusual congressional move that goes like this. Kansas and Nebraska, two territories applying for statehood. So up to that point, we had a 36-30 parallel, so both of those, Kansas and Nebraska, would be in the non-slave states when they applied and were accepted into Congress. Stephen Douglas has other ideas. Stephen Douglas, a Northern Democrat from Illinois, just outside Chicago. Stephen Douglas has other ideas. Douglas says, let's put that whole Missouri Compromise off to the side. Matter of fact, let's upend the Missouri Compromise totally. Instead of these being free states, how about we let the residents of these territories decide and vote as to whether they want slavery or not. He called it popular sovereignty. Remember it? Way back. Popular sovereignty. That's what he wants to do. The South loves the idea, loves it, because they feel like they can, in Kansas especially, they can send thousands of people across the border from Missouri, slave state of Missouri, and from the South to kind of pack the ballot box. Nebraska, probably too far north for slavery to be economically viable anyway. So not really going to be an issue. Why would Stephen Douglas do this? Because in the North is horrified. He totally miscalculates the response in the North. I mean, there's rallies, there's almost riots, he's hanged in effigy in a couple of things, in a couple of events in the North. Why would Stephen Douglas do this? I'll tell you why. Political reasons. Stephen Douglas, Northern Democrat, very ambitious, the little giant they called him. Little because he's little in stature, giant because he has big ambitions. He wants to run for president at some point. Some point probably soon, maybe 1856, maybe 1860. And he knows he's going to need Southern Democrat, that is slaveholder support, right, to get elected. No question about it. And so he needs to throw them a bone. And that's one of the things that he does. And the other thing is, there's a lot of talk at that point about a transcontinental railroad. Now, it's still a dozen years from actually happening. But the South wants that transcontinental eastern terminus, so-called eastern terminus of the railroad, to be in the slave state of Missouri, St. Louis. Stephen Douglas wants the eastern terminus of that railroad to be in the free state of Illinois. Lo and behold, his home state, Chicago. And that might help him with his presidential ambitions. And so, like I said, he puts this forward. He's a very self-aware guy. There are all these rallies and anti-Stephen Douglas things that are happening in the North, and they burned him in effigy, like I said. Stephen Douglas observes the following, that he could find his way home from Washington, D.C. to Illinois at night by the light of his own burning effigies. It's a very self-aware guy. So he pushes it through. It gets approved by the House and by the Senate. Charles Sumner, of course, is outraged by this, and speaks about it again and again and again. But more importantly than that, thousands of Southerners go to Missouri, thousands of go to Kansas from Missouri, thousands of Northern abolitionists go to Kansas. Kansas becomes the center of the slavery debate for all of 1855 and a good portion of 1856. Slavery debate in the United States in 1855, the center of it is not Boston, is not South Carolina, it's not Washington, D.C. It's the center of the American continent, Kansas. There are murders, there are rapes, there is property destruction, there is violence galore. It's called Bleeding Kansas. That's where the term comes from. And it's as a direct result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the rushing of both sides to make Kansas either free or slave. There's two different legislatures, a pro-slavery legislature, an anti-slavery legislature. It's messy. Hundreds of people from Kansas, anti-slavery people particularly, write to Sumner and say, please, sir, help us. Help us. You're the anti-slavery voice. What are you going to do about this? And Sumner finally decides to do what he does best, and that's to give another speech. And I say that with all due respect. He's a great orator. And on May 19th and May 20th of 1856, he delivers a 5-hour speech, 3 hours on the first day, 2 hours on the second day, called The Crime Against Kansas. It's a barn-burning speech. And had he stuck to the issues, history may have been very different. But Sumner always felt that he could put personal insult and invective in his speeches, because he always said, if I insult somebody personally, it will get their attention, and then they'll listen to me about policy. And so, in the midst of this speech, Sumner decides to sort of train his oratorical guns, I would say, on the U.S. Senator from South Carolina, Andrew Butler. Butler, one of the strongest, most ardent pro-slavery senators from one of the most ardent pro-slavery states, Andrew Butler. Now the problem is Butler's not in the chamber at the time. He's home recovering from a stroke that left his face partially paralyzed. And so when he spoke, he had a very difficult time speaking. He would spit a little bit as he spoke. He had a very tough time getting words out. Sumner picks on that in his speech. He says every time he would speak, he would expectorate. And then that double meaning, every time he opened his mouth, out flew a blunder. But he also says this about Andrew Butler. He has a mistress who is beautiful and chaste in his eyes, but ugly and polluted to the rest of us. I am talking about the harlot slavery. So he uses this harlot, prostitute term as the image of slavery. Now, in the chamber, which is packed, by the way, packed, people love to hear Sumner because they knew he was going to be controversial and he was a great speaker. In this particular case, even the ladies' gallery was filled to overflowing, one of the New York Times reporters wrote. So the place is packed, and there are murmurs galore while he's insulting Andrew Butler personally. Southerners are aghast, but Northerners are too, like they think he went too far. Stephen Douglas, of Kansas, Nebraska fame, said, "That damn fool is going to get himself killed by another damned fool." Sumner ends the speech, and the next day, Sumner's speech is all the talk of Washington. Most people, even the northern senators and some of his northern supporters, are kind of outraged. Some of this apoplectic that he would choose this tactic. One person in particular is very angry, and that's Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina. Brooks was from the Edgefield section of South Carolina, western part of South Carolina. For those of you who are fans of the Masters, about 30 minutes from Augusta, Georgia. That's Edgefield, South Carolina. Very pro-slavery section of South Carolina. He's outraged. Same home state as Butler, but not just that. He's also Andrew Butler's second cousin. He's Butler's second cousin. So he starts to plot ways. How am I going to avenge Andrew Butler's honor? Get revenge against Charles Sumner. Talks with his colleagues that night, the night of the 20th and over into the 21st, talks to his colleagues, and they suggest different things. Preston Brooks says, listen, how about a duel? I'll challenge him to a duel. No, his colleagues say. A duel is only reserved for gentlemen to engage. Sumner does not rise to the level of a gentleman. If you ask him for a duel, that's kind of like a violation of our code of honor, so no. Preston Brooks says, okay, well, how about I ask him to step outside and we'll just settle this like men? No, they say, his colleagues say, Sumner will never come out and talk to you. He will instead demand that you come to his desk, which I think is probably true. So Brooks finally decides on what he's going to do. And late on the morning of May 22nd, 1856, it's about 11:45, quarter to 12, Preston Brooks walks into the Senate chamber with his cane. Now, not unusual for him to have a cane. He had actually been wounded in a duel in the hip. Back in 1840, he used a cane all the time. But he comes in, the Senate is out of session. There had been a funeral of a House member, and both houses adjourned early that day. So the Senate's out of session. There's maybe 25 people milling around, members of the press, a couple staff people, some senators. And one of the people is Charles Sumner, who is sitting at the front of the room at his desk, kind of legs, he's a big guy, 6'4", has kind of big legs, is sort of tucked under the desk. He's right up against the desk. The desk is manacled to the floor. That's how those worked at the time. His chair is on rollers. And his head's down, and he's signing copies of his pre-printed Crime Against Kansas speech. He's franking the speech, as the expression went. And that would go out to different constituents. That would go out to newspapers across the country. That's how word got out. So he's kind of oblivious to, this sort of, I would say, informal casualness that's happening around him. Brooks comes in with two of his colleagues and immediately sits down. Why? He says later, there's a lady in the chamber. She's talking to the sergeant at arms. He certainly couldn't do what he came to do with a lady present. That would be totally unchivalrous. So he sits. She leaves after 10 minutes. Right around noontime, Brooks rises, cane in hand, starts making his way down the aisle. Sumner still completely oblivious. Signing and signing and signing. Preston Brooks makes it up to Sumner and says, "Mr. Sumner." Sumner raises his head, sees Brooks, and at that moment Brooks says, "I have read your speech over twice. It is a libel to me, is a libel to my state and to my kin." And slam, brings the cane down on the top of Sumner's head. Sumner's head explodes in blood immediately. And the bloodlust, I think, really causes Preston Brooks to lose it. He begins to beat Sumner again and again and again. Sumner's doing his best. He can't get out from under the desk, basically. Kind of forgets his chair's on rollers. He's kind of wedged in there. Finally tears the manacles from the floor, tears the desk out as he's trying to escape with this roar. Preston Brooks grabs him by his lapel, essentially, and keeps beating him. He says later, Brooks does, "I hit him with 30 first-rate stripes. Every one of them went exactly where I intended, and by the end, he was bellowing like a calf." His cane shatters. He's only holding onto the knob, still basically beating him. A couple of newspaper guys tried to make a move, and Preston Brooks' friend said, "Let them go, let them be." And finally, near the end, Sumner is virtually unconscious, almost unconscious. One of Brooks' colleagues pulls him aside and says, "You don't want to kill him." And they leave. Sumner, just before he slips into unconsciousness, says, "I can't believe such a thing has happened." The caning becomes front page news across the country the next day. Remember, we have a telegraph. News gets out very quickly. 3,000 newspapers in the United States at this time. Just about everybody who could read, and literacy rates were high, just about everyone who could reads one. So it goes across the country like a brush fire, news of the caning. And there's two very distinctive kind of reactions. In the South, there is jubilation and glee. Sumner finally got what was coming to him. These abolitionists have become far too uppity. They want to completely change and alter our way of life. Preston Brooks gets almost, not total, but almost universal commendation from the South. Editorials, everything. He receives gifts from many Southerners, and they're gifts that are canes, many of them printed on it, "Hit him again." In the North, very, very different. Even people who were not Sumner fans, even people who were not abolitionists, even people who thought Sumner was too radical on his slavery positions, and that was thousands of people in the North, who were pretty much, I would say, ambivalent about slavery. Didn't think it was the greatest thing in the world, but it didn't affect them every day, so they were ambivalent. Those people become supporters of Sumner. They have nowhere else to go, essentially, politically. They're outraged at what happens to Sumner. And during the summer and fall of 1856, so this happened in May, during the summer and fall of 1856, Sumner is out of the Senate. He would be out of the Senate for almost 3 years, by the way. Head injuries, back injury, terrible spinal pain, neck pain. trauma, PTSD, all of it. In fact, he goes to Europe twice to try to recover, subjects himself to this horrible treatment when a French surgeon suggests that one of the ways to alleviate his back pain, his spine pain, is for him to rub an open flame up and down his bare back. Somebody gets burned 5 times in 1858 by this French surgeon. Talks about it later, it's awful. Suppurations and boils on his back. He can barely stand. He's bedridden for weeks after these treatments. But right in that summer and fall of 1856, while Sumner's struggling to get back, many of his colleagues, many people who share his beliefs, many Republicans, this is a very fledgling Republican Party, barely 18 months old, formed just as an anti-slavery party, almost entirely. Many of them say to Charles Sumner, don't rush back. Make sure you're well. Why? Sumner's dying to get back. He's like, I need to get back to work. Why? Why don't we want you to rush back? Because your vacant chair speaks even more effectively than you could. Some of the Republicans used it to recruit members of the party during the summer and fall of 1856. And it's so successful. Thousands of Northerners become anti-slavery Republicans. It's so successful that the Republican Party, 18 months old at its oldest, much newer in other places, the Republican Party puts up its first candidate for president in 1856, and he almost wins. He almost wins, John C. Fremont. Loses only because he lost a couple of northern states. But the South sees, with that 1856 election, that a united North could elect a president of the United States without a single Southern electoral vote. Hello, 1860 and Abraham Lincoln, which is exactly what happens. So caning has this unbelievable effect and helps the Republican Party grow, and yes, Lincoln get elected in 1860. Sumner finally comes back from Europe, comes back from these treatments, makes it back to the Senate, and in 1860 delivers really what is his final major anti-slavery speech, and the last anti-slavery speech in American history, June of 1860. The barbarism of slavery is what it's called. It's another 4.5-hour speech. And Sumner just lays bare all the evils of slavery. Economic evils, moral evils, religious evils, social evils, all of it. Hasn't lost a single mile per hour off his fastball. There's a lot of questions, would he? But he did not. But there is no further anti-slavery speeches in the summer and fall. And after Lincoln's election, of course, the South begins to secede. And so Sumner gives the first major anti-slavery speech in 1852 and the last major anti-slavery speech in 1860. I just want to say a couple quick things about Sumner and Lincoln, which is a big part of this book, and then get to your questions. Sumner and Lincoln had this really good relationship. A very short relationship. Sumner doesn't meet Lincoln until Lincoln comes east for the inauguration. Inauguration was on March 4th in those days. Got moved to January 20th later. So in February of 1861, after the Lincoln as president-elect comes east, very kind of famous trek east, comes to Washington, D.C., and that's where they first meet, and of course he's assassinated in 1865. So it's this 4-year friendship. They have lots in common, Sumner and Lincoln. They're both tall, both 6'4". They both detest slavery, although Sumner is much, much more vociferous in his anti-slavery views. They both revere the Union. They want the Union to stay together and to persevere. They both revere the founding documents and the founding fathers. They also have differences, and they learn from each other. Sumner teaches Abraham Lincoln the importance of standing up for convictions regardless of the political consequences. He is on Lincoln almost immediately after war starts to make the war about more than preserving the Union, to make it about eradicating slavery. He's in Lincoln's ear almost immediately. He's in Lincoln's ear almost immediately to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. He's in Lincoln's ear almost immediately after Congress passes a law abolishing slavery in Washington, D.C. in April of 1862. President Lincoln delays signing the bill. It's a compensation thing. The slave owners are going to receive compensation in D.C. By the way, the first and only case in all of American history where slave owners received compensation was the D.C. bill that gets approved in April '62. Lincoln's taken a while to sign it. Have we given enough compensation to the former slaveholders in D.C.? How will the people feel about it? Am I getting enough feedback from them? Blah, blah, blah. Sumner goes to the White House and says to Lincoln, do you know who the largest slaveholder in the country is? And Lincoln says, no. And Sumner says, it's you, Abraham. There are 3,000 slaves in Washington, D.C. Sign this bill and free them. And he does. Lincoln does. So Sumner really teaches Lincoln a lot, I think, in that area of political courage. Lincoln, on the other hand, teaches Sumner a great deal as well. One of the things Lincoln teaches Sumner is that politics is necessary and important and sometimes vital when we're making policy decisions. Example, the Emancipation Proclamation. What does it say? The Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves only in those states that were in rebellion against the United States. That is, the Confederate States of America. That's what the Emancipation Proclamation states. However, there are 4 border states, Union border states, part of the Union, in which slavery thrives during the Civil War. Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri. There's Missouri again. Slavery is alive and well in those states. Sumner says to President Lincoln, wait. You have to make this Emancipation Proclamation apply to those 4 northern states. I mean, how hypocritical can we be? You're putting out an Emancipation Proclamation that's freeing them in the South. You have 4 states part of the Union where there's slavery. How hypocritical can you be? Lincoln says to Sumner, Charles, hold on a second. I'm paraphrasing. Hold on a second. I hope to God, he says to Sumner, that I have God on my side, he says to Sumner, in this struggle. I hope I have God on my side. But I must have Kentucky. Kentucky has farmlands to feed our troops, factories to make armaments for our troops. It is on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers strategically. We need that. It's kind of a protector of Indiana and Illinois and other northern states. And he said, Charles Sumner, I'm afraid if I include these border states in the Emancipation Proclamation, Kentucky will secede. And if Kentucky secedes, look at your map, Maryland will follow. And look at your map again. If Maryland follows, D.C. is right there. We may lose the whole ballgame. So no, I'm only having this Emancipation Proclamation apply to those southern states. Sumner gets that. Takes him a while, but he gets it. So Lincoln teaches him that. The other thing Lincoln teaches him is the importance of sense of humor. As I said earlier, Sumner has none, Lincoln has a great deal. So when he first meets Sumner, in that February of 1861, he's in the hotel lobby and he's receiving people as president-elect. Lincoln is. In comes Sumner. And Lincoln's like, wow, here's another guy that's the same height as me, 6'4". I don't see that too often. So he says to Sumner, let's stand back to back to see who's taller. Sumner is completely phonics by this request. does not know what to do with it. He kind of mutters something like, Mr. President-elect, how about instead of standing back to back, we stand with our front united against the slave power? And Lincoln's like, okay, like you're Debbie Downer, I'm just joking. And so after he leaves, Lincoln says, that man, I've never met a bishop before, but that Sumner reminds me of a bishop. He's very imperious, has no sense of humor, you know. But after a while, Sumner sees humor, sarcasm, which by the way were big parts of Lincoln's presidency, very sarcastic. Sumner sees that maybe it can work. I'm not suggesting he becomes a comedian at all. I'm suggesting that he sees exactly what humor can do to sometimes help diffuse tense situations and things like that. Last thing Sumner learns from Lincoln is the power of the human connection. Again, Sumner not great at it. At Grant's headquarters in Virginia, just before Richmond, just before he goes to Richmond, his headquarters are right next to a large Union hospital with about 5,000 wounded Union troops. Now these are what I would call Civil War wounds, and you guys know what I'm talking about. Amputations, shattered soldiers, just the way the shot was at the time. Terrible, terrible wounds. Sumner and Lincoln are there at the same time. Sumner comments afterwards that he saw President Lincoln in 1864, shake the hand of almost everyone in that hospital. And Sumner said he seemed to know exactly what to say to each man. He seemed to know exactly when to move on to the next bed. He seemed to know how to be inspirational without being patronizing. Sumner was in awe of this because he was not good at that. So Lincoln teaches him just a little bit about that. So I'll conclude with this and then get to your questions. Charles Sumner does see his anti-slavery dream realized when slavery is abolished in 1870 with the 13th Amendment. His equal rights takes a much longer time. He gets caught up. He dies before Reconstruction is over. Reconstruction becomes kind of mixed, a terrible mix of things with the Compromise of 1877. Story for another book. Not a bad book. I'm not doing it. I'm just saying. Story for another book. But I will say this. I think Charles Sumner believed, like we owe him a debt of gratitude, he believed in the United States of America. He believed in it even as he held up a mirror to the country's faults, right? He believed in it during the slave power's kind of rise when he first gets to Washington. He believed in it after his own caning. He believed in it even after the South secedes and war begins. And he believed in it even during this messy period of readmitting these southern states. He did. He was a believer. He believed that America, with her promise fulfilled, right, would change the world, could change the world in a positive way. So I think we really owe him like a debt of gratitude. We owe him for his courage. We owe him for his relentlessness. We owe him for how difficult job that he did, his hard work. You know, in the book I say, you know, him trying to speak against slavery and abolish slavery was like digging a well with a spoon. So we owe him for that. Most of all, I think we owe him for his vision, right? A vision that would allow him to imagine and to fight for a more perfect union in the country he believed in so, so deeply. Thank you very much. I need some of that for questions. So when we do the questions, I will repeat them, so if I can hear them, you can hear them. So feel free. Yes, ma'am.
I have two, if you don't mind.
Yeah, two with each having 4 parts, or just 2 with just. I'm joking. Go ahead.
Okay. Was Preston Brooks ever punished
Okay.
for what he had done?
Let me answer that right now.
Okay.
And then you can get to your second.
Okay.
Was Preston Brooks punished for what was? Yes, so Preston Brooks was found guilty of assault, and his sentence was a $500 fine, which most of his colleagues kind of chipped in to pay. There is a move to oust him from the House, right? To eject him, remove him from the House, which requires a 2/3 vote. They do not get a 2/3 vote, they get a majority vote to remove him from the House. But Brooks, very proud guy, because of even the majority vote, decides to resign his seat in the House and runs for re-election for his own vacant seat 6 weeks later and is elected almost unanimously. So he's back in there. However, the kind of Preston Brooks twist in the tale is that in January of 1857, Preston Brooks dies of a throat infection. So now that's 8 months after the caning incident, January of 57. And there's a huge pilgrimage from Washington, D.C., where he dies. 26 men from Edgefield, South Carolina, come to take his body back to Edgefield for burial. I've been to that cemetery. It's got this obelisk stone, and they bring him back. And on the way back, thousands of people line the streets, to pay homage to Preston Brooks. That's another thing that kind of makes the North wonder, wow, maybe it's going to be very difficult to compromise, after that. But make no mistake about this, Preston Brooks was as big in that 8-month period, May 56, January 57, as John C. Calhoun was before him and Robert E. Lee was after him. Now, he doesn't have the staying power of either of those two guys, the historic staying power. But in the moment, in the historical moment, Preston Brooks is just as revered. What's your second question? We'll come back to you. We'll come back to you. Think about it. Okay. Yes, sir.
2 questions.
Yeah. Well, wait a minute. Are you sure? Because she forgot her second question. Go ahead. I'm joking. Go
I
ahead.
remember mine.
Yes, go ahead.
The first one, you spoke about Sims being held in a jail in Boston.
Yeah.
And then marched down phalanx of soldiers.
Yeah, they called it a hollow square.
Where physically?
Court Street. Do you know where Court Street is?
You're a Boston guy. You're where? Right, Court Street?
Court Street. Yeah, the courtroom was right on Court Street, which is right near Tremont Street.
Yeah.
You know where it is.
Yeah.
Not too far from the old State House, like if you guys want to get your bearings. Yeah. It's kind of like right now a back street, you know what I mean? You kind of cut through that street. But
Thank you. Don't be able to do that.
What's your second question?
The second question is, whatever became of the cane?
Whatever, the cane was destroyed. So there's rumors about the cane that it was in the Massachusetts State House, it's hidden here, it's hidden there. No, the cane was shattered into pieces. Many of those pieces were picked up by Southern lawmakers and fashioned into chains that they wore around their necks in solidarity with Brooks. Wow. The actual cane is shattered. There are numerous replica canes, including one at the University of South Carolina Museum, which I've been to. Yeah, the original cane is pretty much destroyed.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Yeah.
Did they ever speak to each other after that happened?
Did they ever speak to each other after it happened? No, they didn't. In fact, after Brooks dies, Sumner even says, again, I'm paraphrasing, I don't hold it against him, what happened to me. He was a tool of the slave power. Words to that effect. But no, they never do speak.
So he never missed it.
Right. You got your second question? Let's hear it.
Okay. Did Sumner come from an abolitionist family? What made him?
Yeah, great question. What made Charles Sumner, like his family background is? So, a couple things I'll say. His dad was a very strong, even though he didn't get along well with his father, his dad was a very strong anti-slavery person. He was, I would say, an abolitionist before the term really existed. Sumner's father was one. But Sumner, I think, there's a couple of different trips that really change his focus. One is, when he's 23 years old, after he graduates from Harvard, he goes to D.C. It's kind of like a rite of passage to go to D.C., his manhood, stepping into manhood. And he sees the slave auctions, and he sees some of the slave pens, and it really has an impact on him. He thinks about that, he writes about that, comments about it later. But then he goes to Europe for the first time in 1838, goes for 2 years. Again, another rite of passage. And he goes to England, gets an earful from the English, why haven't you people abolished slavery yet? Now, the English are kind of like the reformed smokers who are complaining about smokers. The English barely abolished slavery about 25 years earlier. So now, of course, so he gets an earful from them. But more importantly, he sees blacks and whites in England, in France, and in Italy at lectures together, at museums, at cultural events, and he sends one letter home, I think that's very telling. It was in Italy, and he sees a black man at a lecture, and he says, we had a conversation afterwards, and it was like really a very good conversation in this group. It would seem to me that the issue with blacks in America is one of lack of opportunity, not the general nature of things. Words to that effect. So that really has an impact. When he comes back in 1840, gets back into doing the law, he's a lawyer, he hates the law. He doesn't really like the law. It's dusty, he doesn't like going through ledger books, etc., etc. Almost dies from illness in 1844. Almost dies. His sister, Mary, who's the only person in the family he does have a good relationship, does die. So he comes out of that 1844 saying, I want to do something more with my life. Gets involved in like mental health reform, education reform, prison reform. None of them really satisfy him. And he finally, during the Mexican War and the acquisition of Texas, kind of used that as a way that is deemed to be an extension of slavery or a desire to extend slavery. And he speaks out, really delivers this really stem winding speech in 1845 that kind of makes him, I would say, a minor celebrity in Boston. And then it's that Sarah Roberts case in 49 that makes him a celebrity nationwide. Good. Those are very good questions. You are forgiven for getting that, sir. Yes. What else? Yes, sir. Yeah, sure.
How much of a catalytic effect, if any, did the caning have on the commencement of the Civil War?
Yeah, no, well, the question is how much of a catalytic effect did the caning have on the Civil War, the advent of the Civil War? No, I think it's the title of my book is, in 2012, is The Caning, the Assault That Drove America to Civil War. So to me, even though it's 5 years, it takes 5 years, right, 56 to 61, to me the caning is the event that takes the slavery issue from a political issue, a religious issue, sometimes even an academic issue, and turns it into this really gut-wrenching, emotional issue. And if you follow the dominoes after that, the Dred Scott decision, the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 58 where Lincoln mentions the caning, John Brown's raid in 59, John Brown mentions the caning. So I think it's very catalytic, to use your words. I think it puts the country inexorably on the road to civil war. So it makes kind of, let's say, compromise impossible. So yes, very astute question on your part. Yes?
Thank you for your time and being here tonight.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
A question for you. You've obviously done extensive research during this era and this period and reviewing a lot of source documents. I'm curious, what do you think, or how would you think Charles Sumner may think about the polarization of today's political climate and the steadfast attempts to dismantle the Civil Rights Act of 1964?
Yeah, so I'm always cautious about this because I view this period like another version of the question that you're asking is, are we there again? Are we there? And I always tell people, absolutely not. I view this 1850 run up to the Civil War, particularly that 10-year, that decade period, as unique in American history. We have always been very, very polarized in many different ways. Like I can go through the whole era, from, John Quincy Adams to isolationism versus all-inners before the Second World War, et cetera, et cetera. So I think in the 1960s, I mean, it's just this whole period of the country's existence. Part of it is you have these differences, and sometimes great differences of opinion. So I don't subscribe, agree with, like you'll hear it often, this is the worst time since the Civil War. It is not. I do not think so. There's issues on both sides. Both sides have issues. Both sides have points they want to make. Both sides have things they don't agree with. Is it magnified? I'll say this. Is it magnified by social media? Very much so. I think there's this kind of 24/7 drumbeat. Like I have this theory. I'll tell you what I mean. I have this theory that in the first 6 months of 1942, when German U-boats off the coast of, right off our east coast, sunk about 600 merchant ships. I have this theory that if we had 24/7 cable and social media, Roosevelt would have been impeached. Would have been impeached. That 600 merchant ships were sunk by U-boats. What are you doing about it? So I feel like that has magnified things. That has, in some ways, made it disproportional, if you will. But I just feel like that 1850, 1860, those 2 decades, there's nothing in American history like them. So take heart. Take heart. And, yes, go.
Thank you. As a native of East Walpole, there was a very influential man and his son, Charles Sumner. I have to assume that there was some kind of a connection in, at least in liking or respecting the character of the man.
Yeah, perhaps so. I mean, Sumner he has no children. He had a disastrous marriage late in his life. He was 56, married a woman who was 28. That story is in the book, and I will tell you guys, I'm not, take it for what it's worth. It's the steamiest part of the book. It's a very public, disastrous marriage. That's part of that. So he has no children. He has, I think, 3 nieces. His sister Julia, who moves to California. And then, there may be some, I don't know his whole family tree. I know that much about it. But I would...
Sumner Bird was named.
Well, I might assume that, but I might also assume the Sumner Tunnel was named for him, and it was not. So I don't know. I just, Sumner Bird, that's the name? Yeah, I don't know.
Charles Sumner Bird.
Yeah, Charles Sumner Bird. I mean, I don't know, man.
And he was very influential
in Walpole.
This time.
Yeah, perhaps, yeah. I try not to, if I don't know anything about it, I don't want to like pretend I do. So that's, yeah. Yes, sir. Phil, yes. I'm sorry I called you sir. I'm only kidding.
Is there a particular place in Massachusetts where all his papers are?
Yeah, so Sumner's papers, good question. Sumner's papers, most of my work, they're all collected. They're all in Harvard originally. They're all on microfiche at the Boston Public Library. And they've collected it from many different sources. He wrote a 15-volume, what he calls works. That's kind of like a collection of his speeches, his feelings after the speeches. But if you look at something like that, as time goes on, this always happens with primary sources, which is why it's important to look at primary sources closest to the event. As time goes on, people who keep diaries, as he basically did, the diary makes you more and more important as your life goes on, right? So, it's best for you to look at the letter from 1853 rather than Sumner's 1893 recollection of what happened in 1853, right? Always better. So he was a prolific letter writer, thousands of letters. Even when he was recovering from the caning, he would always lament, I only wrote 5 letters today, slacker, But so he's a prolific letter writer and received hundreds of letters.
So we complain about too many emails.
We do, yeah. But keep in mind, those letters, like, it's a time when letters were very revealing. You know, like intimate in a way. You know, just like you would tell details in letters that you might only say face to face. I mean, some people might text it now. You know, I think that's a possibility. But the letters were very revealing. You know, long. You know, but that's how people communicated. You know, yeah. All right. Oh, yes.
I just want to mention one thing for those people who don't know about it, but there's a Black History Walk on Beacon Hill in Boston that covers
There is, yeah.
of Sumner's life, and it's worth doing. I don't know whether they still offer it, but
Yeah, well, and also Sumner's house is on the backside of Beacon Hill, and there's a plaque there as well. There's a statue of him in the public garden. There's a statue of him in Harvard. If you ever get to Harvard Square, they just say Sumner, which at the time was all you needed to say. They both were erected in the late 19th century, and everybody knew Sumner at the time. So listen, you guys have been fantastic. I really appreciate it. Come and see me whether you buy a book or not. Sign up for my mailing list. I do 3 to 4 e-newsletters a year. I won't be spamming you with a newsletter every day. 3 or 4 a year. The next one's going to be in December. And I'm busy working on book 9, topic as yet undisclosed, but that will be disclosed around, probably my first newsletter of 2026 will be disclosed. So you'll know what the new book is if you sign up here. Thank you so much. Walpole, as always.
thank you.